Our first fairy tale we're going to start with today is Sleeping Beauty. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with this. You've either read it in a book or seen a movie. So you probably will notice some things that you're very familiar with as you hear this story. But it might be a different version than you've heard before. We talked about versions of stories before. So it might be similar, but you might also notice some differences, maybe in characters or problems or solutions as you listen to the story. So as we listen today, I want you to focus on asking and answering questions. We've done this a couple times before. We did it in geology when we did geology, where I said that you were the expert. You became the teacher like I am the teacher, and you were going to ask questions about the story. So as you listen, I want you to come up with 6 different questions for each question word. I want you to come up with a who question, a what question, a when question, a where question, a why question, and a how question. And I will say coming up with questions for fairy tales is a lot easier than coming up with questions for geology. So as you listen, you'll probably think of a lot of questions that you can ask. Then when we're done reading, I'll post your assignment and you will write down your questions, and then you will either have someone who has also heard the story answer them. Maybe a parent watched the video with you and heard the story, or you can answer the questions as if you had given those questions to somebody else to answer, okay? All right, before we start reading, I want to talk about something that you're going to hear in our story. It's called a spinning wheel. Now, if you were in Duval County last year for kindergarten, you read about colonial towns and townspeople, so you might be familiar with spinning wheels. A spinning wheel is a tool used to spin thread and yarn. So on a spinning wheel is a spindle, which is a stick-like tool that is where the thread or yarn goes after it is spun, and it makes a collection so that people can use it. People use parts of plants like cotton or even parts of animals like wool to make string and thread, similar to this one. Okay, so a spinning wheel is what is used to spin all of this thread together so that people can use it to make clothes or blankets or other things. In the story today, you're going to hear the word spinning wheel and spindle, so I wanted to make sure that you knew what that was before we started reading. Once upon a time, I heard a characteristic of a fairy tale there. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who for many years were very sad because they had no child. At last, a daughter was born to them, and the king was so happy that he planned a great feast in the palace to which he would invite all of his friends and relatives. So I heard a couple more things about fairy tales there. I heard some royal characters, a king and a queen. A palace was the setting, which we know castles sometimes are settings in fairy tales. Now, in his country, there were 13 fairies. Of course, the king wished to invite all of the fairies to the feast too, so that each might look kindly upon his child and perhaps give the baby a special fairy gift. But as the king was preparing, he noticed he only had 12 gold plates for the fairies to eat from. So it was decided that one fairy had to be left out. Now let's pause for a minute. How do you think that 13th fairy will feel about not being invited to the feast? The feast was held, and what a wonderful celebration it was. As it drew to an end, the fairies came forward to give the child their special gifts. One said to the child, "I give you the gift of virtue, so that you may be good." Virtue is another word for goodness, so this fairy gave the child the gift of goodness so that she would be a good child and a good person. Another said, "I give you the gift of wisdom, so that you may be wise." We know that wise means smart and you make good choices. A third fairy gave the child the gift of beauty. A fourth gave her riches. And on it went, with each fairy giving everything in the world that anyone could wish for to the baby girl. "11 of the fairies had given their gifts, and the 12th was just about to speak, when suddenly in came the 13th fairy, the one who had been left out. She was very angry, and she cried out in a loud voice, 'When the princess is 15 years of age, she shall prick herself on a spindle and die.'" Well, let's stop for a minute. Prick means to make a small hole or cut on yourself. And the spindle is that sharp pointed piece on the spinning wheel used to make the yarn and the thread. So this fairy said that when the princess was 15 years old, she was going to prick herself on that spindle and die. I think we definitely have our evil character. What do you think? Without another word, the angry fairy left the hall. Everyone was terrified at what she had said. Then the 12th fairy came forward and said, "I cannot undo the evil spell, but I can soften it. Here then is my gift to the child. The princess shall not die, but she will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years." Okay, so let's stop for a minute. So the 12th fairy is trying to give the baby girl another gift, and her gift is that she is making the spell less evil. So instead of the baby dying when she pricks her finger when she's 15 years old on the spinning wheel, on the spindle, she's just going to fall into a sleep for 100 years, which is still a pretty bad spell. The king was determined to protect his child. "Surely," he said, "my daughter cannot prick herself with a spindle if she never sees one." So he gave an order that every spindle in the kingdom should be burned. So let's stop for a minute and discuss that. I think we have a major problem here. The major problem is that the 13th fairy, who was not invited, put an evil spell on the baby. But the 12th fairy had a solution, and the king had a solution. The 12th fairy's solution is that she made the spell less evil. She softened it to make it less bad so that she wouldn't die, but she would only fall into a sleep for 100 years. The king's solution was to burn all of the spindles, because surely if all of the spindles are burned and there's none around, well, then she can't prick her finger, and then the evil spell would never be cast on her. So that's a pretty smart solution. The princess grew up, and all of the fairies' gifts to the child were plain to see. She was good, wise, kind, and beautiful. Everyone who saw her loved her. On the day that she turned 15, the king and queen were away from the palace. The princess was left on her own, and she wandered about the palace, looking into all sorts of places and peeking into rooms that she had never explored before. She climbed a narrow, winding stair that led to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of it. She turned the key, and the door opened. And there, in a little room, sat an old woman with a spinning wheel, busily spinning away. So let's stop and make some predictions. What do you think is going to happen next? "Good day," said the princess as she entered the room. "What are you doing?" she asked, for she had never seen a spinning wheel before. Why hadn't she ever seen a spinning wheel? That's right, because remember, the king had all of them burned so that she would never be able to prick herself. So since they were all burned, she had never seen one. I am spinning, said the old woman. The princess stretched forth her hand and asked, What is this thing that spins around so merrily? But she had barely even said the words when she pricked her finger on the spinning wheel's spindle, and in that very moment, she fell into a deep sleep. At the same time, sleep fell upon everyone in the palace. The king and queen, who had just come home and were in the great hall, fell fast asleep. The horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, and the flies on the wall all fell asleep. Even the fire in the hearth went out. The wind stopped, and not a leaf fell from the trees. In time, a hedge of thorns began to grow around the castle, which grew thicker and thicker and higher every year, until at last nothing could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on the highest towers. So a hedge of thorns is a group of thorns growing. So if you look in the picture here, you can see a hedge or a group of thorny vines growing up, covering the castle. As the years passed, stories spread throughout the land of a beautiful princess sleeping behind a wall of thorns. Many young princes came, but none could break through the thorns. But at long last, after many, many years, there came into the country a king's son, who heard of an old man tell that there was a castle standing behind a hedge of thorns, and that there a beautiful, enchanted princess was sleeping. The prince said, I shall make my way through and see the lovely princess. The old man warned him that many had tried and failed, but the prince would not listen. For now, the 100 years were at an end, and the day had come for the sleeping princess to be awakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it changed into a hedge of beautiful flowers, which bent aside to let him pass through. When he reached the castle yard, he saw the horses and dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting with their heads under their wings. As he entered the castle and climbed the steps, the prince saw everyone still asleep. The king, the queen, the cook, the maids, everyone. It was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. At last, the prince went up the narrow, winding stair and came to the room where the princess was sleeping. When he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn his eyes away. He bent down and kissed her, and she opened her eyes and smiled at him. Together they went down the stairs, and they saw the king and queen waking up and all of the people in the castle waking up and looking at each other in great surprise. The horses in their yard got up and shook themselves. The dogs sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof flew into the fields. The flies on the wall buzzed and crept a little farther. Even the kitchen fire leapt up and blazed. At last, the wedding of the prince and princess was held with great feasting and rejoicing, and they lived happily together for the rest of their lives.